The day I found out my brother had stolen everything our father left me, I was standing in a hospital hallway, still wearing the same clothes I'd slept in for 3 days straight. My father had been dead for exactly 11 days. The lawyer on the other end of the phone was speaking slowly, carefully, like he was trying to soften a blade before he pushed it into my chest. He said, "I'm so sorry to tell you this, but the will we have on file, the one your brother submitted, it's not the one your father signed with us." I went completely still. The fluorescent lights above me buzzed. A nurse pushed a cart past me and didn't even look up. And all I could think was, he actually did it. My own brother actually did it. What happened next took 14 months. And by the end of it, my brother didn't just lose the inheritance. He lost everything he had ever built. Have you ever trusted someone so completely? Someone who shared your blood, your childhood, your memories, and then watched them look you dead in the eyes and lie? My father's name was Raymond. Raymond Earl Calloway. He was the kind of man who fixed other people's fences before he fixed his own. He coached Little League for 11 years, even though neither my brother nor I played baseball. He kept a jar of peppermints on the kitchen counter and offered one to every single person who walked through his door, whether that was the cable man or the pastor or a complete stranger who'd knocked asking for directions. He was, without question, the most quietly generous person I have ever known in my entire life. And the fact that his death became the centerpiece of the ugliest, most calculated betrayal I've ever witnessed, that's the part that still makes me catch my breath when I think about it too long. I need to go back to the beginning because without the beginning, none of the rest of it makes sense. My brother Marcus is 4 years older than me. Growing up, I worshipped him the way younger siblings do, completely, uncritically, with a devotion that didn't ask for proof. He was the kind of older brother who could talk his way out of anything and into everything. Charismatic doesn't even scratch the surface. Marcus could walk into a room of strangers and walk out with 3 new best friends and a dinner invitation. He had the kind of laugh that made you feel like the funniest person alive just for being near him. My father used to say Marcus could sell sand to the Sahara, and he meant it as a compliment. I was different, quieter, more careful. I went to the State University on a partial academic scholarship, studied accounting, graduated, moved to Nashville, got a job with a mid-sized firm doing financial auditing. I built a small, tidy, honest life. I wasn't flashy. I didn't have Marcus's gift for walking into rooms. But I was stable, I was careful with money, and I was, I believed, a good daughter and a good sister. Marcus never really settled. He started a landscaping company in his mid-20s that did well for a few years, then went under during a bad winter when he couldn't make payroll and lost 3 of his best crews. After that came a used car lot, then a failed restaurant, then some kind of import business that was so vague none of us ever really understood what he was importing. There were always deals on the horizon, always an opportunity just around the bend. My father bailed him out twice that I know of, $20,000 the first time, and closer to 40 the second. Marcus always paid him back, eventually, partially, with promises to cover the rest when the next thing took off. My mother passed when I was 17 and Marcus was 21. Cancer. Fast and ruthless. She was gone in 8 months from diagnosis to burial, and my father never fully recovered from it. He went on. He functioned. He still fixed fences and handed out peppermints and coached Little League. But there was something behind his eyes after she was gone that had just gone quiet, like a lamp with a dimmer turned way down. My father and I were close in the way people get close when there's no buffer between them anymore. I called him every Sunday afternoon. I drove back to Harlan County for Thanksgiving and Christmas and usually one random weekend in the spring, just to sit on his porch and drink sweet tea and listen to him talk about whatever he'd been thinking about. He loved to talk about history, about plants, about the old families in town. He was a talker, my dad, in that unhurried Southern way where a 15-minute story might take an hour but you didn't mind because the company was the point. Marcus called him too, but not as regularly. And when the calls came, my father told me they were usually about something. A loan. A favor. A reference for some business contact. Marcus loved Dad. I genuinely believe that. But Marcus also had a way of making love feel like a transaction without ever quite saying so out loud. In the summer of 2019, my father had his first heart attack. It was mild, they said. A warning shot. He was 68 years old, still sharp as a tack mentally, but his body was beginning to show its age and the grief it had carried for 2 decades. He came through the hospitalization fine, made some dietary changes, started walking every morning, and told me in a phone call that fall that he'd been thinking about getting his affairs in order. "I'm not being morbid," he said. "I'm being practical. Your mother didn't get to do any of this. I want to make sure things are clean and clear when the time comes." I told him that was smart. I offered to help him find a good estate attorney if he needed one. He said he already had someone, a lawyer named Gerald Holt, who had an office in the next town over and had handled a property dispute for my father years earlier. He said Gerald was thorough and honest, and he trusted him. Over the next few months, my father updated his will with Gerald's help. He had a house, paid off, worth somewhere around $220,000, a savings account with a little over $90,000, a life insurance policy for $150,000, some antiques, a truck, and about 15 acres of land that had been in the family for generations. He also had a small investment account that had been quietly growing for 20 years. He told me what he intended to do with it. He was going to split things, but not exactly evenly. He wanted to leave me the house and the land because he knew I would keep it in the family, and Marcus likely wouldn't. He wanted to split the savings and the investment account equally between us. The life insurance would go to both of us, split down the middle. And Marcus would get the truck and the tools and the workshop equipment because Marcus had always been the one who used them. It was thoughtful. It was measured. It was so completely, thoroughly my father that when he described it to me over the phone on a Sunday afternoon in October of 2019, I remember just sitting quietly for a moment and feeling a swell of love for him so strong it almost hurt. He had thought about all of it, about what each of us needed and valued, and what made sense for each of our lives. I asked him if he'd talked to Marcus about it. He was quiet for a second. I told him the basics. He seemed fine with it. I didn't push. I should have. I understand now that I should have asked more questions about that conversation, because Marcus, as I would eventually discover, had not been fine with it at all. Marcus had simply decided, quietly and without a word to anyone, that he was going to do something about it. My father's second heart attack came in November of 2021. This one was not mild. I was at work when my phone rang, and it was a neighbor of his, a woman named Dottie, who lived 3 houses down and had been looking in on him since the first scare. She found him on the kitchen floor. He was alive when the ambulance came, but only barely. I was in the car before she finished telling me. 4.5 hours from Nashville to the hospital in Knoxville where they'd airlifted him. Marcus got there before me. He'd been living in Chattanooga by then, closer. When I arrived, Marcus was in the waiting room, and he hugged me and he cried, and I held on to him like we were children again, and our mother had just gotten her diagnosis and the world had tilted off its axis. Dad made it through the surgery, but he never really stabilized. He spent 8 days in the ICU, and on the 9th day, on a Tuesday morning with gray November rain streaking the windows, he was gone. He was 70 years old. He never regained enough consciousness for a real conversation. I held his hand. I talked to him. I told him about the drive down and about the peppermint I'd found in his coat pocket when I got his things from the nurse. I told him I loved him every single day I was in that hospital. I don't know if he heard any of it. I believe he did. Marcus and I handled the immediate arrangements together. There was a strange, suspended peace between us in those days, the kind that grief creates, where everything petty gets temporarily dissolved in the enormousness of loss. We picked out the casket. We wrote the obituary. We called the relatives, divided the list in half, and made the calls. We sat together at the funeral, and both of us held it together until the preacher read the 23rd Psalm, and then neither of us did. It was 11 days after the funeral when Gerald Holt called me. I was back in Nashville by then, back at work, operating on autopilot the way you do in the early weeks of grief. The call came at 11:30 in the morning, and I almost didn't pick up because I didn't recognize the number, but something made me answer. Gerald introduced himself and said he was calling because he needed to speak with me about my father's estate. He said he had been contacted by my brother the week before, and that Marcus had delivered a document, a will, that he claimed was the most current version of my father's final wishes. Gerald said he'd reviewed it carefully. And then he said the thing that stopped my blood cold. Miss Calloway, the will your brother submitted is not the document your father executed in my office. The signatures don't match. The notarization is from a notary I've never worked with and that your father, to my knowledge, had no connection to. And the provisions are substantially different from the will I hold in my files. I sat down. I was already sitting, but I sat down more, if that makes sense. I sank. Different how? I heard myself say. Gerald paused. The document your brother submitted leaves the entirety of the estate, the house, the land, the savings, the investment accounts, the insurance proceeds, to Marcus. Your name appears only in a small bequest. A piece of jewelry that belonged to your mother, and personal photographs. The fluorescent lights. The cart rolling past. The nurse who didn't look up. I said, Gerald, what does the Real will say? He told me. It was almost exactly what my father had described to me on that Sunday phone call in October of 2019. The house and the land to me. The savings split equally. The investment accounts split equally. The insurance split equally. Marcus got the truck and the tools. It was measured and thoughtful and thoroughly my father. The document Marcus had submitted was a forgery. I want to stop here for just a moment because I need you to understand what I felt in that instant. It was not rage. Rage came later. In that moment, what I felt was something more like the ground disappearing beneath me. Because this wasn't a stranger. This wasn't a con artist or an enemy or someone with a grievance against me. This was Marcus. Marcus, who had held me while I cried in that waiting room. Marcus, who had helped me write our father's obituary. Marcus, who knew every single significant moment of my life because he had been in most of them. He had done this while our father was dying. He had done this while I was sitting at a hospital bedside holding a man's hand and telling him I loved him. Somewhere in those days, Marcus had obtained a fraudulent document, found a cooperative or corrupt notary, and filed it with the probate court as the legitimate last will and testament of Raymond Earl Calloway. He had tried to steal everything our father had worked for his entire life. He had tried to erase me from our father's story. I thanked Gerald. I asked him to secure every document he had and not to release anything. He said he had already done exactly that and that he intended to report his findings to the probate court. He told me I needed an attorney, quickly. He recommended 2 names, and I wrote them both down on the back of an envelope, the handwriting so shaky it barely looked like mine. I sat at my desk for a long time after that call. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I just sat there, staring at the 2 names on the envelope, and I made a decision. I was not going to fall apart. I was not going to call Marcus screaming. I was not going to post about it on social media or call my aunt or tell anyone who might alert him that I knew. I was going to be very, very careful. Because I understood something in that moment with a clarity that surprised me. Marcus thought he had won. And the best thing I could do was let him keep thinking that while I built the case that would undo him completely. I called the first attorney on Gerald's list that afternoon. His name was Patrick Drummond, and his office was in Nashville. His assistant got me in for a consultation the next morning. I drove there at 7:50 a.m., sat in a clean, quiet office with a cup of coffee I couldn't taste, and laid everything out for Patrick with the same precision I used when I was auditing financial records, which, given that I was an accountant by trade, turned out to be more useful than I'd expected. Patrick listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Walk me through the forged document one more time. What exactly did Gerald say was different about it?" We went through it together. I had already asked Gerald to email me the details, and Patrick read them carefully. He asked about the notary. Had I ever heard of her? Could my father have had any connection to her? I said no to both. He asked if my father had shown any signs of diminished capacity in the years before his death. I said absolutely not. He'd been mentally sharp until the end, and I had years of phone calls, texts, and visits to demonstrate that. Patrick nodded and said that was important. What Marcus may not have counted on, Patrick said, leaning back slightly, is how thorough estate fraud investigations can get. This isn't just a civil matter. Submitting a forged will to probate court is a criminal act. In Tennessee, That's a Class D felony. If we can establish that Marcus knowingly submitted a fraudulent document, we're not just talking about correcting the estate distribution. We're talking about potential prosecution. I heard that word, prosecution, and something shifted in me. Not excitement. Not satisfaction. More like the click of a lock turning into place. What do I need to do? I asked. Patrick had a list. The first thing was documentation. Every phone call, every text, every email between Marcus and me and between either of us and my father. Anything I had that established what my father's intentions were. I went home that night and spent 4 hours going through my phone. I had hundreds of texts from my dad. I had voicemails I'd never deleted. I had the audio of a voicemail from October of 2019 where he told me clearly, in his own unhurried voice, exactly what he planned to do with his estate. I transferred everything to a secure drive and backed it up in 3 separate places before I went to sleep. The second thing was silence. I was not to contact Marcus about any of this. Not a word. Not a hint. Patrick would handle all communication through proper legal channels. Marcus had already filed the fraudulent will with the probate court, which meant there was a paper trail, and the moment the court was alerted to a competing will and to evidence of fraud, Marcus would be formally notified. But that notification would come from the court, not from me, and it would come at a time and in a manner that served our case rather than giving Marcus any opportunity to prepare. The third thing was patience. Patrick was honest with me. This would take time. Months, probably. There would be hearings. There would be filings. There might be a deposition. There might be a criminal referral that moved on its own timeline independent of the civil probate case. I needed to be prepared for a long road. Are you prepared for that? He asked. I've been an accountant for 10 years, I said. I'm very good at following a long trail to the end. He smiled at that. I didn't smile back. I wasn't feeling much like smiling. Those first few weeks after I retained Patrick were some of the strangest of my life. I was living in a kind of double reality. On the surface, I was just a woman in grief, going to work, coming home, eating dinner alone, calling my aunt on Sunday instead of my dad. Underneath, I was methodically assembling documentation, answering Patrick's questions, reviewing affidavits, and trying to understand exactly how my brother had done what he'd done. Some of the how emerged gradually through the investigation. The notary Marcus had used was a woman who worked out of a mail center in a suburb of Chattanooga. She was not currently active with the state notary database. Her commission had lapsed the previous year, which meant the notarization on the forged will was not only suspicious, but technically invalid. Investigators would later determine that Marcus had paid her, though she would claim she hadn't fully understood what she was notarizing, an explanation that convinced no one but that she stuck to. The document itself was a combination of plagiarism and fabrication. Marcus had apparently used portions of a generic will template, incorporated some language that closely mirrored my father's real will, which suggested he'd seen it or had access to it at some point, and changed the key provisions to suit himself. He'd gotten the typeface wrong. He'd gotten the margin formatting slightly wrong. And, critically, the signature was wrong. Gerald Holt, who had witnessed my father sign his real will and had a notarized copy in his own files, was able to provide a detailed comparison. A handwriting expert Patrick brought in confirmed. The signature on Marcus's document was not Raymond Calloway's. None of this happened quietly. The probate court, once Gerald filed his competing will and Patrick filed our formal contest of Marcus's submission, opened an investigation. A court-appointed administrator was assigned to oversee the estate while the legal dispute was active. This meant Marcus could not access any of the assets, not the accounts, not the house, not anything, until the matter was resolved. I know the moment he found out. Patrick told me the date the court notification went to Marcus's attorney. Marcus had hired a lawyer, naturally, once our contest was filed. His name was listed in the court filings, and I looked him up, mid-level estate attorney, not a criminal defense specialist, which told me something important about what Marcus believed he was dealing with. I think Marcus thought this was going to be a fight between 2 wills. I don't think he understood yet that it was going to be a fight between a forged document and a crime. I have tried many times to imagine what it must have felt like for Marcus to receive that notification. To understand that Gerald Holt had kept the real will. That there was a handwriting expert. that there was a formal fraud investigation now running alongside the probate contest. I've tried to imagine it, and I can't. Not because I lack imagination, but because I cannot conceive of being that far gone from your own conscience that you could do what he did and still be surprised when it catches up to you. He called me about 2 weeks after the notifications went out. I had been expecting the call. Patrick had prepared me for it. The advice was simple. Don't discuss the case, don't make accusations, don't confirm or deny anything about what I knew or what we had. If he called, I could answer, but the moment he brought up the estate, I was to say that my attorney was handling all estate matters and direct him to contact Patrick. The phone rang on a Thursday evening. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea and a book I hadn't been reading. I saw Marcus's name on the screen. I picked up. "Hey," he said. His voice sounded different. Lighter than it should have. Too light. Like someone performing relaxed rather than actually being it. "Hey," I said back. There was a pause.
"So," he said.
"I guess things are getting complicated. A lot has happened since Dad passed," I said carefully.
"Yeah."
Another pause. "Listen, I want to talk to you about some of the estate situation." "Marcus," I said, "my attorney is handling all of that. If you want to discuss anything related to Dad's estate, you or your attorney can contact Patrick Drummond." Silence. "You have an attorney?" His voice had shifted. The performance of casual was cracking.
"Ido."
"I didn't know that. When did you?" "Marcus, I'm not going to discuss this with you. That's what attorneys are for." Another silence, longer. When he spoke again, the light had gone out of his voice entirely. "I just want you to know," he said, "that I loved Dad too. Whatever you've been told, whatever you think happened." "Good night, Marcus," I said. And I hung up. I sat there for a moment, and then I picked up my tea, and I took a long, slow sip, and I noticed that my hand was completely steady. Not trembling at all. I had thought it might tremble. It didn't. The months that followed were, from a legal standpoint, extraordinarily thorough. Patrick was meticulous. He had practiced estate and probate law for 23 years, and he treated the fraud in my father's case with the kind of focused attention that you could tell came not just from professional obligation, but from genuine outrage. He told me once that in all his years of practice, he had seen maybe a handful of outright forgeries. "People do all kinds of manipulative things around estate documents," he said. "They pressure, they coerce, they manufacture confusion. But actually forging a will and filing it with the court, that takes a particular kind of audacity. Or a particular kind of desperation." I thought about that. Marcus's latest business, the import thing, had apparently been struggling. I learned this later, through channels I didn't expect, specifically through the forensic accountant Patrick brought in to review the financial situation around the estate. When you're investigating estate fraud, you pull threads, and some of those threads lead to places that illuminate motive. Marcus had debts. Significant ones. A business loan gone sideways, some personal credit lines that had been maxed and partially defaulted, and what appeared to be a cash flow problem that had been worsening for about 18 months before my father died. The total picture was somewhere between $200,000 and $300,000 in the red, though the full accounting was complicated by the opacity of Marcus's various business structures. My father's estate, in total, was worth somewhere around $600,000 when you included everything: the house, the land at current market value, the accounts, the insurance. To someone drowning in that kind of debt, $600,000 must have looked like a lifeline. Marcus had known from what my father had told him that the split was not going to be even. He had known the house and the land, the most valuable assets, were going to me. And at some point, drowning in debt and desperate and possessed of the kind of creative self-justification that Marcus had always been capable of, he had made a decision that cost him everything. The probate court ruled in December of 2022, 14 months after my father's death. The forged will was invalidated. Gerald Holt's document, my father's real, legally executed, properly notarized last will and testament, was admitted to probate. The estate would be distributed as my father had intended. The house and the land came to me. The accounts split equally. The insurance split equally. Marcus received the truck and the workshop equipment. But that was only the beginning of what December brought. The same week the civil probate ruling came down, the district attorney's office in Hamilton County, that's where Marcus lived, filed criminal charges. Forgery in the first degree. Filing of false instrument. Fraud. The specific charges varied slightly from what Patrick had initially outlined as possibilities because the criminal investigation had taken its own shape, but the core of it was simple. Marcus had fabricated a legal document, paid someone to fraudulently notarize it, and filed it with a court of law in an attempt to defraud his sister of her rightful inheritance from their deceased father.
Those are not small charges.
I was not in the courtroom when Marcus was arraigned.
I didn't want to be.
This is something people sometimes find hard to understand, why I wasn't there, watching it happen. But I need you to know, I didn't do any of this for the satisfaction of watching Marcus suffer. I did it because the alternative was allowing a lie to stand. Allowing the last act of my father's life, the careful, loving thought he put into providing for his children, to be stolen and replaced with a fabrication. That I could not allow. I was there for my father. The rest of it, what happened to Marcus legally and professionally and personally, was the consequence of what Marcus had chosen to do, and it was going to happen whether I watched it or not. Marcus's attorney negotiated a plea agreement. I was kept informed of the major developments by the DA's office because I was the victim in the case, but I was not involved in the negotiations. The plea came through in the spring of 2023. Marcus pleaded guilty to 1 count of forgery and 1 count of fraud. The sentencing guidelines for a first offender in his situation allowed for probation rather than prison time, and that is what the judge imposed: 3 years of supervised probation, a significant fine, mandatory restitution to cover legal costs, and a permanent felony record.
Un permanent felony record.
I want you to sit with what that means for a man like Marcus. For a man whose entire professional existence had been built on deals, on relationships, on the ability to shake hands and make promises and convince people to trust him. A felony conviction for fraud and forgery doesn't just follow you. It defines you. It appears on every background check. It eliminates whole categories of professional licensing. It changes how banks see you, how landlords see you, how business partners see you. For a man who had spent his entire adult life relying on his ability to make people believe in him, a permanent fraud conviction is not just a legal outcome. It is an identity. His business, the import company that had been struggling, collapsed within months of the criminal proceedings becoming public. A few of his remaining clients had apparently waited to see how the legal situation resolved. When it resolved with a guilty plea, they dissolved their contracts. His primary lender called in the loan. By the summer of 2023, Marcus was filing for personal bankruptcy. I learned most of this not through any direct contact with Marcus, but through peripheral channels, mutual family members, small-town news that travels even when you're not in the small town anymore, and eventually, a brief conversation with my aunt, who felt compelled to tell me that Marcus had moved in with a friend because he'd lost his apartment. She told me this carefully, watching for my reaction, I think expecting grief or guilt or something. I felt neither. I'm sorry he made the choices he made, I told her. I'm not sorry about what happened to him because of them. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, Your father would have been heartbroken. My father, I said, was the one Marcus tried to steal from. I think Dad's heart had the right to be broken by that. She didn't have an answer for that. Neither do most people when I say it. In the fall of 2023, I took possession of the house. I drove down from Nashville on a Saturday morning, the same route I'd driven 100 times before for holidays and random spring weekends, and I pulled up in front of that old house and sat in my car for a while before I went inside. The neighbor, Dottie, had been keeping an eye on it during the legal proceedings. She'd watered the plants that could be watered and left the ones that couldn't. She'd made sure the heat was running so the pipes didn't freeze. When she saw me pull up, she came out onto her porch and waved, and I waved back, and there was something in that small, ordinary gesture, someone who had loved my father's proximity, watching over what he'd left, that hit me harder than almost anything else had. Inside, the house smelled like him. Like wood and coffee and the faint ghost of the peppermints he always kept on the counter. His reading glasses were still on the side table. His calendar was still on the wall in the kitchen, open to November 2021, the month he died. There was a grocery list in his handwriting on a notepad by the phone. Milk, bread, coffee, batteries. Such ordinary, living things. I stood in his kitchen for a long time. I looked at that grocery list. And then I sat down at his kitchen table. The same table where I'd eaten thousands of meals as a child, where I'd done homework and had arguments and listened to him talk about history and plants and the old families in town. And I let myself cry in a way I hadn't really let myself cry since the hospital. Not about Marcus. Not about the court case, or the fraud, or the 14 months of legal proceedings. About my father. About the fact that he was gone, and the world was smaller without him, and no legal victory, however complete and thorough, and just was going to change that. Raymond Earl Calloway was gone. The jar of peppermints was empty. And the only inheritance that had ever truly mattered, the memory of who he was and how he lived, that was mine and always had been, and no one could have forged or filed or stolen it away. I stayed in the house for the weekend. Slept in the guest room because I wasn't quite ready for his room. Walked the land on Sunday morning with a cup of coffee, 15 acres of Tennessee soil that had been in this family for 3 generations, the light coming through the trees in that particular fall way that makes everything look like it belongs in a painting. I thought about what I wanted to do with the house. Keep it, certainly. I had always known I would keep it. But whether to use it as a weekend place, or eventually move back, or something else entirely, that was a question for a future version of me who had done a bit more healing. As for Marcus, the last I heard, which was early 2024, he was doing some kind of manual labor work, which is honest work, and I say that without any sarcasm. He was living modestly. He had not, as far as I knew, attempted to contact me since that phone call more than 2 years earlier. I did not expect him to. I didn't know if I would answer if he did. People ask me sometimes whether I feel guilty, whether I feel like I should have handled it differently, maybe talked to him first, given him a chance to come clean, tried to work it out privately before involving lawyers and courts. And I understand why people ask that. It's a natural impulse, especially around family. The desire to preserve relationships, to believe that problems between people who share blood can always be resolved between those people, without the involvement of the law. But here is what I know. Marcus did not make a mistake. He did not act impulsively in a moment of grief or panic and then immediately regret it. He planned this. He found a notary. He created a document. He filed it with the court. He sat next to me at our father's funeral and held me while I cried, and then went and did this thing deliberately and without apparent remorse. He then proceeded to act as though the fraudulent will was legitimate and waited for the estate process to move forward in his favor. That is not a mistake. That is a campaign. And campaigns require responses, not conversations. More than that, he tried to take something that my father had spent a lifetime building and that my father had, with great care and love, decided how to distribute. My father's last wishes were not just a legal document. They were an expression of who he was and how he saw his children and what he wanted for them. When Marcus forged that will, he wasn't just stealing from me. He was erasing my father's voice. And that I could not forgive quietly. There is something I want to say about the process itself because I think it matters. When I went to Gerald Holt's office after that phone call and asked to understand what had happened, the real will, the fraud, all of it, Gerald told me something that I've thought about many times since. He said my father had been very clear when he executed his actual will about one specific thing. He said my father had told him, "I want everything written down and witnessed properly because I want my children to know exactly what I intended. I don't want there to be any confusion or any arguments. I want it to be clear." My father was a man who fixed other people's fences, who offered peppermints to strangers, who coached Little League for 11 years because he believed in showing up for things. He was also a man who knew his son well enough to want things written down clearly. I don't know if he feared Marcus might challenge the will. I don't know if he had some sense, some parental intuition, that something might need to be documented carefully. He never said anything like that to me. But he was thorough. He was precise. And because he was thorough and precise, and because Gerald Holt was the kind of attorney who keeps copies of everything, the truth was preserved. The record existed. The real will survived. My father protected me, even after he was gone. I think about that a lot. On the Sunday afternoons when I sit on his porch now, I've been going back more often, making the drive down from Nashville just to sit and be in that space. I think about the fact that he sat in Gerald Holt's office and was careful. And that carefulness, that fundamentally Raymond Calloway quality of doing the thing right and thoroughly and honestly, was the thing that ultimately meant the truth came out. I have forgiven my father for anything and everything he ever did in his life, because he was a human being who did his best and loved his children and put out peppermints on the counter for whoever walked through the door. I have not yet forgiven Marcus. I'm not sure I will. I've read things about forgiveness, that it's for you, not for them, that carrying anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to suffer. And maybe that's all true. But I also think there's a difference between releasing anger and pretending a thing didn't happen. I don't carry rage around with me.
I've put it down.
But I've also looked clearly at what Marcus did and what it reveals about who he is, and I've decided that my life will be quieter and more honest without him in it. That's not bitterness. That's just clarity. The house is still standing. The land is still there. The peppermint jar is empty, but I haven't thrown it away. It's still on the counter, where it always was, and sometimes when I'm washing dishes I look at it, and I feel my father in that room with me. And the will. The real one. The one my father signed in Gerald Holt's office with witnesses and care and intention. It's framed on the wall of the study. Not the full document, obviously. Just the first page, with my father's signature at the bottom. His handwriting. His intentions. His voice, preserved. That is what inheritance really is, I think. Not the house or the land or the accounts. Not the numbers in the distribution. It's the voice of someone who loved you, speaking clearly even after they're gone, saying, "This is what I wanted for you. This is how I saw you. This is what I believed you deserved." My brother tried to silence that voice. He failed. And in failing, he lost something that no court could restore to him and no plea agreement could address. The chance to have been the kind of person his father believed he was. That, in the end, is the only loss I pity. And if this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Because sometimes justice really does win.